When it comes to the Gospel of Matthew chapter 13, you'll notice that there's seven parables basically dealing with the kingdom of heaven, right? So the first four have to deal with God's presence. Where is God in the world? Where is he working? How is his grace being made manifest even right now in the context of the world? And so these parables include the parable of the sower, the parables of the weeds and the wheat, the parable of the mustard seed, and the parable of leavened bread. But then, of course, we suddenly transition to the final three parables: the parable of the buried treasure, the parable of the pearl of great price, and the parable of the dragnet. And so the whole idea is that once we come to identify God's grace and God's presence in the world, the only thing left for us to do is to actually choose. To choose to go God's way, to choose to correspond to his grace. And so for our purposes today, I want to focus exclusively on those last three parables to emphasize again the importance of choice when it comes to the spiritual life. So when it comes to the parable of the buried treasure, the story here is relatively simple and straightforward. So basically there's this guy, he's walking around, and all of a sudden he discovers this treasure which is buried in the field. And so the first thing I want you to notice here is that you don't discover a buried treasure simply by staying at home. Now that said, the takeaway message isn't simply to go outside, but rather to live with a reflective heart. To not just allow ourselves to be plunged into stress and busyness and distracting forms of pleasure, but again to live the reflective life. To kind of examine our choices to see whether or not these choices actually conform with our underlying desires to be happy, to be at peace, to be conformed to our final end, if you will. And so, for example, let's say you make a decision which in retrospect was a bad decision. Instead of simply feeling bad about it or simply trying to avoid making a similar decision in the future because your mom told you to do so or because the church told you to do so, perhaps you might avoid that particular thing in the future because you recognize in your heart that thing didn't leave me feeling happy, or that choice didn't leave me feeling more free, more peace, all these things which correspond to the deep desires of my heart. Okay, so that's kind of the first thing. Again, this invitation to live with a reflective heart. But the second thing I want you to notice here is that this guy who's the principal actor when it comes to the parable of the buried treasure, he has this intuition, this correct intuition, that in order to properly possess this treasure which is buried in the field, he can't simply steal the treasure, he has to actually acquire the field, which requires him to sell everything to purchase that same field. And it speaks to this notion that in order for me to follow Christ with sincerity, to follow him with integrity, to fully possess the Lord and everything that entails, again, peace, joy, happiness, and freedom, something in me needs to die. I need to die to the old sinful self in order to fully possess Christ and everything that he wants to give to me. But that, of course, leads us again to the second parable, and that again is the parable of the pearl of great price. Now, the story here again is relatively simple and straightforward, right? So there's this merchant. He's been searching for fine pearls for much of his life. He has many pearls in his possession. But then all of a sudden he discovers the pearl of great price, as a result of which he sells all his pearls to acquire that one pearl. Now again, we find ourselves hitting on some familiar themes. And so again, we encounter this invitation to live with a reflective heart. And we also find this familiar point that in order to fully possess the Lord, we need to give him everything and hold back nothing. But that said, there are a couple things I want to bring to your attention which are unique and specific to this particular parable. And so the first thing I want you to notice here is that this merchant in this particular parable, he simply refuses to settle. He simply refuses to give his heart entirely to that which simply does not satisfy. And the thing I want to draw your attention to is how amazing this particular quality actually is. And so if you think about it, shades of that really famous story that you find in the book of Genesis, the story of Adam and Eve, where in preparation for giving him the gift of Eve, the one to whom he is called to give himself in this covenantal relationship, the Lord parades before Adam a bunch of animals, as if to say to Adam, do these things do it for you, right? Do you feel you're called to intimate communion with the lobster, the chimpanzee, the cow, if you will? And of course, what the Lord is doing in giving Adam the particular task of naming the animals, he's basically preparing his heart for that which is to come. But more to the point, in the meantime, Adam is called to be honest, to never settle in terms of giving his heart entirely to that which is simply beneath his own dignity and worth. And again, that's precisely what you find in the context of this particular parable, right? And so, again, you have this merchant, and God bless him, he doesn't know exactly what he's looking for, but he knows that he will know it when he finds it. But in the meantime, again, he simply refuses to give his heart to that which is less, to give his heart to that which is false. But that brings us to the second takeaway message with regards to this parable, and for my money, this is the most important part. And so you'll notice in the context of this parable, there's a certain kind of tension in the text. And so again, if you look at how the story actually plays out, the merchant sells all his pearls once he discovers the pearl of great price. But if you think about it from a strictly financial perspective, that would seem to be a somewhat imprudent move. And so the more prudent thing would seem to be for the merchant to sell many of his pearls, perhaps even most of his pearls, to acquire again the pearl of great price, as opposed to selling all of his pearls, because what if it doesn't work out, if you will? But you see, the key to resolving this particular tension in the text is to realize that once the merchant acquires the pearl of great price, he's done being a merchant. So despite the enormous amount of time and effort he must put in to learn his craft, to distinguish between different pearls of different value, at the same time, once he discovers again the pearl of great price, he's done being a merchant. So the resolution in his heart going forward, even though it might sound kind of strange, is to spend the rest of his life in contemplation, to fully enjoy simply being in the presence of this pearl of great price, the thing he was always looking for in retrospect throughout the course of his life. And you see, in this, we're meant to discover this really subtle but important message to really appropriate the value of contemplation. When you're going about your life and you discover anything which is of the Lord, anything which is authentically good and true and beautiful, instead of simply passing by these particular moments of grace, to rest in these moments, to taste and see that the Lord is good, to kind of enjoy these things in a sense of contemplation, if you will. That's a really important part of the spiritual life, and that's an important prerequisite to becoming the person that God is calling to be. But that brings us to the final parable I want to talk about today, and this is the parable, again, of the Dragnet. And so, obviously, this is an analogy for the final judgment. And so basically, as the parable goes, there's this special type of net called a dragnet, which is dragged through this body of water, as a result of which it catches a whole variety of different fish. And then, of course, the net is dragged to the shore, and the fish are then sorted out. And so the good ones are kept, and the bad ones are kind of thrown away. And so again, it's this really striking image of the final judgment. Now again, a couple takeaway messages here. And so first of all, this notion that everyone will be judged based on his or her own merits. And you know that because the net catches every fish of every kind, which is to say, for example, that a goldfish will not be expected to be a trout, and vice versa. And so again, the same takeaway message is meant to apply to each one of us, in the sense of saying to us that each one of us, again, will be judged in his or her own merits, based on the time and opportunity and grace that God has given to each one of us in our own particular circumstances in this life. What this means, practically speaking, is that it does you absolutely no good, first of all, to compare yourself to other people, but also to judge other people. Because again, every single person has received the corresponding grace to become the person that God is calling that person to be. And the fact of the matter is, we don't really know who it is this other person is called to be in the mind and imagination of God the Father. Now, that said, the second thing I want you to notice with regards to this particular parable is the sheer objectivity when it comes to the final judgment. And this comes through once you pay attention to a particular translation issue. And so basically in the original Greek, when the fish are being sorted out, they're sorted into two categories. Basically that which is beautiful and that which is rotten. And so even right now, when you hear the particular tenor of those particular words in contrast, again, that which is beautiful as opposed to that which is simply rotten, there's a certain sense of, again, objectivity which is conveyed when it comes to this notion of the final judgment. Because at the end of the day, it will be obvious to everyone involved that which is beautiful versus that which is rotten. But that brings us to the final point when it comes to the parable of the dragnets, which in a certain sense kind of ties all these different thoughts and ideas together in a really neat and concise sort of way. And so basically the whole idea here is that our decisions matter, our choices matter. And so the reality is that whenever we make decisions, especially when it comes to the moral life, good or bad, these things actually conduce to helping us become more or less the persons that God is calling us to be. Now, in the face of it, this particular concept might seem to be somewhat scary and even repulsive on some level, but it's actually a really important antidote to the despair and nihilism of the secular world. Because if you think it through for a sec, if our decisions have meaning and our choices have meaning, what that means, obviously, is that our lives have meaning. Our existence has meaning. It matters whether or not we live, and it matters whether or not we actually choose to go God's way, both for ourselves and for the salvation of the world. Okay, one final example, and I'll kind of end with this. And so recently I had the great privilege of seeing a live stage version of A Few Good Men, which of course eventually became a movie starring Tom Cruise, Demi Moore, and Jack Nicholson. And without going into a whole lot of detail, the characters played by Demi Moore and Tom Cruise are basically lawyers who are defending these people who are accused of murder, right? And so there's a certain point partway through the play where the Tom Cruise character wants to get off the record. So he's frustrated with the case, he doesn't think they have a chance of winning, and so he wants to get off in terms of being the solicitor of record. But then what happens is that the Demi Moore character, speaking in reference to the two men whose lives are on the line, says to the Tom Cruise character, "These guys don't need a lawyer, they need you." And even though it's a really brief scene, I really love it because it really helps to illustrate this thing we're talking about today. Because in the mind of the Tom Cruise character, he's thinking, it doesn't matter whether or not I give up. It doesn't matter whether or not I step to the plate because simply another lawyer can step in and kind of fill in the gap. Whereas in contrast, the Demi Moore character is saying to him that the difference is actually huge. Your choice whether or not to actually go God's way and become the person that God's calling to be, makes all the difference in the world. Because the thing you got to realize is that when the Lord says to you, as he does to each one of us, take up your cross and follow me, that is very much a personal invitation. And the reality is that if you hear that invitation, but you simply refuse to correspond to it, and you don't take that space behind the Lord in terms of carrying the one true cross of salvation, that spot will forever remain vacant because it's meant for you and you alone. Whereas in contrast, if you have the wherewithal to, first of all, listen to the call and then correspond to it by giving the Lord everything and holding back nothing, well, then all sorts of really interesting possibilities arise, both for you and for the rest of the world. And may God bless you all.